Hey everyone, welcome back to Archaeology Tube. My name is Dr. Bill Farley, and I'm a professor of archaeology and anthropology, and with about 15 years of professional experience in the field. You may have come to this video by way of another one that I published last week that was a direct response to the recent Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse led by Graham Hancock. Now, that video got a lot of traction, a lot of comments, and a lot of interesting interactions. One of the most common requests that I got in the comments of that video was to have a little bit more of a debunking, because that video was not meant to be a debunk video. It was sort of more of a request to Hancock to take a couple of actions. And so there's been a lot of great debunking, criticism, thoughtful commentary from archaeologists, non-archaeologists. My biggest contribution to this so far was, in addition to writing some threads and things like that, I compiled that list into a big mega Twitter thread that has dozens of different perspectives from people of all sorts of different backgrounds, some of them professional archaeologists, academics, some of them working in cultural resource management archaeology, some of them not archaeologists at all. So I'll put that in the description of this video so you can check that out, and that's going to go much more broadly than I'll go into here. So I'm going to get into the details and some response to elements of the discussion that I feel I have some expertise in, so things I can actually speak on. Now, with a series like Ancient Apocalypse, Hancock says a lot of stuff. He's bringing up a lot of different points in this show, and all of them can potentially be criticized. But archaeologists are scientists, including myself, and don't often feel confident speaking about things that we don't have a lot of experience and training in. So I'm going to try and keep my thoughts sort of narrow to those things that I can, and hopefully I can send you along to some of those other resources that I provide. Some of those are threads, some of them are articles, blogs, videos, other YouTube videos. So check that out and go see what some of those other folks are saying. So the first thing that I think I can actually speak to is a element that Hancock talks about in the show, and I've seen a lot of people arguing about in comment sections and on Twitter and elsewhere, which is about the so-called Clovis first theory. Critics of archaeology have been using the Clovis first theory to make this assertion that archaeologists are unwilling to change our ideas, to adopt new information, and to adopt new data into our ways of thinking and move the science forward in that way. It's sort of ironic because actually I think the Clovis first debate shows that archaeologists are really willing to do that, and it's actually a primordial example, if you will, of archaeologists doing exactly that. Now, the Clovis first theory works like this. For a long time in archaeology, many decades, the standard theory for the peopling of the Western Hemisphere, that is, how did people first get into North and South America, the people who are presumably the ancestors of today's Native Americans and indigenous people of North and South America. This has been a fundamental debate within archaeology for a very long time. And like I said, a theory came to be standard, that came to be the widely accepted theory that we call Clovis first. So the Clovis culture is this particular grouping of artifacts. So I'm going to use the word culture sort of carefully here, because really, what does the word culture mean? In this case, it's an old-fashioned sort of theoretical approach to understanding a culture, that a culture is actually simply just a series of often related, contextually associated artifacts. In this case, the so-called Clovis point, it's a very distinctive type of spear point, as well as gravers and stone tools made out of exotic materials that sometimes come from very far away, and some other related cultural traits that we find on sites all over North America, starting to pop up around 12,000-ish years ago. Right? This is the so-called Clovis culture. Like I said, it's actually probably a lot of different cultures loosely related to each other or simply passing along a technological tradition among one another. What Hancock sort of accuses archaeologists of doing, and there's a grain of truth in this, is holding too tightly to this theory. It was a very elegant theory. It was based on a couple of things happening in short succession with one another. First, sea levels being lower because of the Pleistocene and glaciers sucking up tremendous amounts of water out of the oceans, which made a section of land called Beringia exposed for some number of thousands of years. And Beringia connected northeastern Siberia to northwestern North America, right? So that you could have a land bridge that you could simply walk across. Now, the word bridge makes it sort of sound like this would have been narrow, but it would have been hundreds of miles wide. So you could simply follow, for instance, a herd of caribou across this bridge and not even know you'd done it. And suddenly you're in North America. And that had to happen simultaneously with the separation of the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets, which created a so-called ice-free corridor that would allow people to then pass down into the rest of the Western Hemisphere. All those things happening together, the existence of Clovis sites all at the same time period across North America, the opening of the ice sheets, and the exposure of Beringia is called the Clovis first theory. And it's got the word first in it because it implies that those were the first people to exist in North and South America. In the 1980s and 1990s, sites started to be discovered. Some of them had been discovered long ago, but they started to be seriously considered that had radiocarbon dates that came from before those series of events occurred. So either they were too old to be Clovis, or they were too old for the ice-free corridor to be exposed, or perhaps even too old for Beringia to be exposed. And these sites came to be known as pre-Clovis sites. Here's the place where Hancock is onto a kernel of truth. There was a very strong debate within archaeology in the 1980s and 1990s about these sites. It took a long time for those sites to be accepted. Because this was an extraordinary claim, it required extraordinary evidence, something I'll come back to later. Were some archaeologists unfair to the archaeologists who were claiming pre-Clovis sites? Absolutely. My old PhD advisor used to call them the quote-unquote Clovis Mafia, which was this group of old-school archaeologists who really felt strongly about the Clovis first theory and didn't want to change their minds. But as more evidence emerged and sites like Monteverde, Paisley Caves, or Meadowcroft Rock Shelter continued to be tested and again seemed to strongly evidence the presence of these sites pre-Clovis, the sites were accepted and the theories were changed. So that by about the mid-1990s, it was becoming standard interpretation that there was in fact some set of sites and some number of people living in North and South America prior to the Clovis people coming up through Beringia and down through the ice-free corridor, right? So that's been the standard theory in archaeology for decades at this point, really about a quarter century at this point. So there's some irony in using this as a criticism for the argument that archaeologists don't want to change their minds. It is true that those theories were not accepted easily and lightly and without great evidence in the 80s and 90s, but they were eventually accepted and they have now become the standard principle experience for archaeologists. Of course, we can add to that even further. We can see a similar thing happening right now, where there are sites that are potentially pushing back that timeline even further, such as the New Mexico footprint site or much more controversially, the Cerruti Mastodon site, that some archaeologists are arguing that means that there might be people in North and South America tens or even 100,000 years earlier. Keep an eye on this channel for a video about the Cerruti Mastodon site, which is, I think, going to be the next thing I do. Idea number 2 that I keep seeing thrown around that is confusing and complicated and I think I can speak to, and that is monetary incentive. One thing I've seen archaeologists accused of a lot this week is that we're too afraid to change our ideas because it will mean we'll see the loss of grant funding, which will then in turn lead to us not being able to do our research. So first off, this idea is silly. It's just fundamentally wrong. Number one, because grant funding doesn't work like that. Grant funding actually tends to strongly favor novel methodologies and findings and is much more likely to be granted to people who are finding new and exciting sites that push back timelines. So I actually think that if this culture turned out to be real and archaeologists actually started finding evidence of it, those folks would get tremendous amounts of grant funding. But the second factor is that grant funding actually funds a infinitesimally small amount of archaeological work in most places in the world. And that's certainly true in the United States, where archaeology is driven primarily by a field called cultural resource management, or CRM for short. CRM archaeology is made up of a series of mostly private companies that operate under the same principle that like environmental scientists do for studying wetlands. When a new project is going to come through and disturb a piece of land, let's say a new highway or a new gas line or something like that, usually, especially ones that are funded or permitted by state or local or federal governments, they often are required to have a CRM survey done, which means they have to have their cultural resource tested by archaeologists and historians and groups that work together. Those folks get together and they do those tests, and they find archaeological sites and they mitigate those sites one way or another. Either they help the construction company avoid disturbing them, or they might excavate them, or whatever. So that's how the mass majority of archaeology is actually funded. Like 95+% of archaeology is funded in many places around the world. So that has nothing to do with grant funding. That is entirely based upon testing landscapes that we don't know where archaeological sites are. So if there are in fact all of these ancient sites like Hancock is describing from some high civilization Pleistocene culture, well, those sites should show up in CRM surveys. So funding, again, in addition to the fact that grant funding, in two ways, grant funding strongly favors novel research and sites that actually push the envelope of interpretation, like the sites that Hancock suggests might be real, and the presence of CRM, and CRM really driving the type of work that gets done in archaeology in many places around the world because it's doing the mass majority of that archaeology. Claim number 3 I've seen thrown around a lot, and this is an old one. This is one that actually gets used anytime archaeology is being discussed. There's a lot of misconceptions about this, is the radiocarbon can't be used to date stone debate. Again, kernel of truth. That is correct. Radiocarbon dating does not date stone. That's true. That's absolutely correct. But there's a lot more context that needs to be added to that to really understand what we're talking about when we talk about radiocarbon dating used to study megaliths and other stone structures in the past, like the pyramids or the upright stones at Gobekli Tepe, which are major elements of the things that Hancock talks about in both his books and in the series. Radiocarbon dating, as the name suggests, dates material that have carbon in them. By and large, that means organic material. So it's going to be dating things that archaeologists typically use C14 dating for: burnt seeds or charcoal or animal bones or shell, something like that. Organic materials, things that used to be alive but are no longer alive. Radiocarbon dating, like all radiometric dating techniques, has limitations, and those limitations are twofold. Every dating technique has at least these two limitations. One is material. The material that you can date with radiocarbon dating is only organic material. You can't use it to date anything else, including stone. So that's a limitation. The second is range. Radiocarbon dating is useful for dating artifacts of a certain time span. That time span is roughly artifacts from about 500 years old to about 60-ish thousand years old. And those two ends actually get pushed as the technology gets better. As radiocarbon analysis gets more precise, we can actually push those boundaries a bit further. But let's say for a shorthand, 500 years to 60,000 years. That's roughly about what it is. That means we can't use radiocarbon dating to date sites that are older than that. So we're not using radiocarbon dating, for instance, to date most human evolution sites. We're not using radiocarbon dating to test dinosaur sites. If we can't use radiocarbon dating to date stones, that's a limitation that applies to the study of, say, the pyramids or Gobekli Tepe. But the date range isn't really relevant for that, because both those sites definitely, whether we accept Hancock's dates or what archaeologists have been saying the dates of these sites, they fall very comfortably within that date range for radiocarbon dating. So we don't need to worry about that so much. But material is a factor. So how do archaeologists use the study of organic materials that we can actually date to date something like the pyramids? Well, we do that through contextual association. And I've seen people really just very quickly throw this idea out there that, well, because you can't date the stones, it doesn't matter. The way archaeologists date anything is by contextual association, spatial and temporal context in relation to those artifacts. The fact of the matter is that archaeological sites get laid down in stratigraphies. They get laid down in certain ways that we can study taphonomically. We can reconstruct the site formation processes of how the site was formed and understand the relationship spatially between artifacts that are associated with one another. We use this for everything. This is the baseline core element of archaeological interpretation. If you're unwilling to accept that spatial association is meaningful in archaeological sites, then throw archaeology in the bin, because it's the whole business. I'm sorry, it just is. So if you want to say there's no way any of these organic materials are actually contextually associated with these stone objects, you're saying, I don't think archaeology is a useful science at all. And I don't think that's what Hancock is arguing at all. I do not think I think if you're going there, you are going way past what Hancock is criticizing about archaeology. I think Hancock believes that spatial context is real in archaeology, so you might want to slow your roll a little bit. The fact of the matter is, that's how we date sites, right? So we find artifacts that are closely associated in space. We make strong assertions that they would have been associated in the past, and so we can use materials we can date, organic materials, to date things that we can't, like stone. There are actually other dating techniques that can be used to date stones, but we're sticking to radiocarbon dating right now because that's what's been criticized. Next issue that's getting tossed around a lot is the so-called Younger Dryas impact theory. The YDI is very important to Hancock's interpretations because they're foundational to it. Younger Dryas impact theory turns out to be incorrect, then none of Hancock's theories really work because it's the motivating factor. It's the thing that supposedly makes this Atlantean civilization disappear very quickly, is that they were struck by this meteor, or this meteor struck in a certain place and caused sea level rises to happen really, really fast, etc., etc. The YDI theory is controversial. And it's not controversial because we disagree with Hancock. It's been controversial for many years before Hancock started using it to support his ideas in this show. So it is something for which there have been peer-reviewed papers offered that have evidence that seems to support it. Things like melted sediments in archaeological sites that experimentally might imply that that happened because of a meteor impact or a mini burst in the atmosphere that would have heated things up really fast, things of that nature. And there have been archaeologists that have criticized that and said that those studies are not accounting for other possible reasons why those things might have happened, right? Now, I'm no kind of an expert on the YDI, but I wanted to say a couple of words on it just to point out that it's not widely accepted theory within archaeology. It's not. It is accepted by some and very, very vociferously debated by others. So what I'm seeing a lot is people online saying, oh, we don't even worry about the YDI. That happened. We know it happened. And that is not true. That is not settled science. So if you trust in scientists at all, and a lot of the scientists who are doing this work on the YDI are not archaeologists, they're physicists, they're planetary scientists, they're geologists. You've got to assume all of those folks are working together in a secret cabal to hide the truth about the YDI, which again, I don't know why they would do that, but that's what we keep getting accused of doing. So maybe. So the YDI, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. It's not settled science. So we need to wait on that. And I think that's worth mentioning here because Hancock's theories are built upon the YDI. It has to have happened for the rest of his theories to make sense. So we should probably be somewhat critical of the YDI and really think about whether it actually happened or not. Okay, next one that I think is kind of interesting is focused on the site of Gobekli Tepe. Now, this is a site in Turkey from right on the verge of the Pleistocene and the Holocene, and it's one of the coolest archaeological sites in the world. Hancock talks about it a lot in his show. You can also watch tons of lectures about it and pictures about it. They have a great website that has cool 3D models that you can navigate. It's one of the most well-researched sites in the world. So first off, there's a lot of people saying like archaeologists aren't paying attention to Gobekli Tepe. That's not true. It's like one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, widely discussed by every archaeologist. So that's false. One of the things that's really been interesting to see is people claiming that archaeologists aren't willing to accept that Gobekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers and instead must have been built by agriculturalists. This is, like with the Clovis first theory, a real strange misconception about how archaeologists accept new theories. It's been around a quarter century, 25 or 30 years, since archaeologists widely believed that Gobekli Tepe must have been built by agriculturalists. It's based on very old-fashioned theory, largely coming from an archaeologist named V. Gordon Childe, about the nature of civilization and what makes a civilization. And Childe, who largely worked in Mesopotamia, believed that there's a set of standards that an archaeological site must meet to be considered a true civilization. And those included things like agriculture, large urban centers, monumental work projects, labor stratification and diversification, and social hierarchy of an extreme degree. All of that was somewhat arbitrary because, well, frankly, archaeologists have been criticizing the notion of what a civilization is itself for many decades now. What makes a civilization? Why is Mesopotamia a civilization or Egypt a civilization, but Cahokia is not? Or the Mayans are not, as some archaeologists would argue, or the folks who lived at Gobekli Tepe are not, or the people who lived at Çatalhöyük are not, or the people who lived at Great Zimbabwe are not, right? So this is a very loaded, long-standing theoretical debate within archaeology about what the nature of a civilization even is. But it's pretty clear at Gobekli Tepe that this site was built before agriculture was widely utilized in the area or at the site. It was probably built by hunter-gatherers, and there is a trend of building that we can follow from the Natufian phase up through the elements of the site that we can see and that are getting talked about in the show that show a kind of straightforward adoption of those practices that we see at Gobekli Tepe. So again, I think this is a misguided attempt to present archaeologists as unwilling to change our minds about something when talking about a site that we changed our minds about decades ago. Okay, so I don't know where that idea is coming from, that archaeologists think that it was built by agriculturalists. We just don't, really. Okay, next one I keep seeing, and a lot of these are related to this, is the archaeologists don't want to share information with the public argument. And this one is actually kind of just silly. If anything, archaeologists are actually too focused on discoveries that drive back timelines or that are really novel and exciting and change the whole notion of what archaeology means. Like I said before, grant funding is actually tied to those sorts of discoveries, and fame and fortune are generally associated with those types of discoveries. So if anything, archaeologists are like way too focused on that sort of thing. And the archaeologists who are doing the nitty-gritty site analysis of sites that we already know quite a bit about are doing maybe more important work in many ways for trying to really understand how history worked and how people actually lived in the past. Frankly, archaeologists are excited to share our findings, whether they be a huge career-defining find like the ones Hancock is suggesting in this show, or the everyday finds of just cool sites that we get to work on that just in small ways give us new information, new facts about how the past played out and how people lived their lives in the past. Ask any archaeologist and you'll get it. I mean, it's been amazing being on Twitter this last week and watching true experts, some of the most important archaeologists in the world, having one-on-one conversation with folks asking them questions, some of them in bad faith, but many of them not, in good faith, and just asking tons of questions and people taking the time to explain it. We want to share this information. We're educators. We're scientists. We want to tell you about it. And we're going to give you that information with the evidence to back it up. Okay, so just ask us. We're happy to talk about it. Final question that I get asked a lot here. Is it possible that Hancock is right? Sure, of course it is. Should we consider his theories? Absolutely, and archaeologists have been for a long time. The problem with what Hancock has presented here is that he presents it as this sort of us versus them, anti-intellectual thing, like we're trying to block his research. It's not true. We're simply asking him to give us the evidence. Show your work. Tell us how you came to these conclusions without them just being conjecture. And he says, well, I'm a journalist. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm just here to ask questions. Well, that's fine. Okay. But you're not going to change the textbook of what we think about the past and what our interpretations are with nothing but questions and conjecture. You need to also bring that evidence. So I'd love to see a guy like Hancock work with archaeologists and get out there and do digs and analyze the material culture and talk about that stuff. Really bring some evidence that's not just look at this thing, isn't that interesting? Maybe it means this. Again, there's nothing wrong with that sort of wish casting. There's nothing wrong with thinking big and dreaming big. And I agree with those who have said that that can be helpful in pushing a science to broaden its horizons and open its mind. But we need more than that if we want to adopt these ideas as fundamental theories and interpretations within the archaeological record. So we come back again, of course, to Carl Sagan's favorite and famous saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Hancock is presenting extraordinary claims here. We'd like to see extraordinary evidence to back them up. But we are willing to change. We are willing to accept new ideas, and we love the enthusiasm that we have seen from so many people this week who are invigorated by some of the things that Hancock says. So come on, hang out with us, come talk to some archaeologists, ask some questions. We're ready to help out any way we can. Thanks, everybody, and have a safe and wonderful week.